Hi, folks. Welcome to another of our broadcasts. Apologies for not having any broadcasts up last week. As I explained, I was away at the Banner of Truth Ministers' Conference with several of my colleagues. We're going to be thinking about the miracles of Jesus. In our last broadcast, we looked at the miracle of the virgin birth and saw why that was necessary. It's interesting that when you read through the Bible, there's actually only a few epochs of time when miracles are common. Uh, for example, at the time of the Exodus, when God redeemed his people from their bondage in Egypt, there were the miracles associated with the various plagues that God sent on the Egyptians. That, of course, was to show Pharaoh who the true God was and to confirm Moses as a God-sent prophet. Then there isn't really hardly any miracles at all until the times of the ministry of Elijah and Elisha. And again, this was to show God's people and others that these men had been called and set apart by God to bring God's message, often his message of judgment, upon his own people for their sinfulness. Then you really have to go to the New Testament and to the time of Jesus to once again be in an era when miracles were commonplace. The miracles that Jesus himself performed and also the miracles that his disciples performed. And the reason that the miracles were performed by Jesus was to convince the people of who Jesus was, that he was indeed the Messiah promised in the Old Testament, that he was the Son of God. It's worth pointing out that the miracles of Jesus were seen and witnessed by many, many people. Most of those people initially would probably have been skeptical about the claims of Jesus, but they nevertheless could not deny what they had seen. And even his most fierce critics and his enemies, they couldn't stand up and deny that Jesus had performed these miracles. They themselves had seen them with their own eyes. They had seen him restoring sight to the blind. They had seen him making people who were lame walk. They had seen him healing a man who had a paralyzed arm. They had even seen him raising people to life who were dead. One thinks of Jairus' daughter. One thinks of the son of the widow of Nain. And of course, the many, many people who saw him raising Lazarus to life. If Jesus' miracles didn't happen, or if they were down to mere human trickery, then Jesus' enemies would have quickly exposed him as a fraud, but they couldn't do that. So we must recognize that the miracles that Jesus performed, which are recorded in the Gospels, are genuine miracles. They cannot be argued away. So what was the purpose of them? Well, it was to show people that whilst he was indeed really and truly human, a real genuine man in every sense of the word, he was nevertheless more than a man. He was, in fact, God who had come to dwell among them in the person of Jesus Christ. Only God could do what Jesus did. No human being had ever, by his own human power, done the mighty works that Jesus did. His mighty works were signs. John in his Gospel chooses 7 of them, 7 signs to point to who Jesus was, and those miracles were done to convince people to believe who he was and to believe the message that he preached. Many people were undoubtedly stirred up and excited by Jesus's miracles. Nevertheless, the fact is, there were actually very few, ultimately, who actually believed in Jesus, who trusted him as the Saviour, the Messiah, who was promised in the Old Testament. You see, because of the people's own erroneous, preconceived ideas with regards to who the Messiah was and what he was going to do for them as the people of Israel, most people, whilst impressed with Jesus, they did not believe him to be the Messiah, and they would not commit to him. In fact, in John 6, we see that when Jesus starts to explain the spiritual nature of his work and the spiritual nature of his kingdom, loads of people turn away from him. And in time, those people would lend their voices to the call for Jesus to be crucified. This shows us, does it not, the hardness of the human heart, the blindness of sinful people. Despite God giving them such wonderful proofs that he had sent his son, they rejected him. People today say, oh, if God were to do miracles, then I would believe. They wouldn't. They wouldn't. They would be exactly like the people in Jesus' day. To the unbeliever, Jesus was and still is despised and rejected by men. But to those of us who are Christians, those of us who are believers, he is altogether lovely. The beautiful Son of God, become man to save sinners like you and me. And in that, brethren, we should rejoice. Every blessing.